Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Plant Diversity and Ecosystem Services on Abandoned Urban Lands, presented by Christopher Swan of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and hosted by Audubon Society of Central Maryland. Our presenter, Christopher Swan, is a professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is a community ecologist with interest in streams and rivers in addition to urban ecology. And his research projects range from understanding controls on carbon processing in rivers to mechanisms underscoring biodiversity patterns at multiple spatial scales in both aquatic and terrestrial urban ecosystems, as well as numerous synthesis activities, both nationally and internationally. Tonight, Chris will be speaking to us about his innovative experiments with native plant communities on vacant lots in the city of Baltimore. If you have a question for Chris, go ahead and type that into the Q&A box, which should appear at the bottom of your screen. Chris will take questions at the end of his presentation, but you can put your question in at any time. You don't have to wait till the end. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Chris.
Thank you very much. I'll go ahead and turn my video on. Share my screen. Thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm happy to talk to you today about the work that we've done in Baltimore. I'll just make sure that all my settings are right. They are. That we did some time ago. We started back in, I think, 2014, and it progressed through some years, and I'll walk you through some of the things that we did. Again, the work's on plant diversity and some ecosystem services that we studied on abandoned urban lands, specifically vacant land in Baltimore City. I want to acknowledge the hard work of two of my graduate students that have now finished, Dr. Anna Johnson and Dr. Dorothy Barowie. Dorothy is now with the Park Service down in DC. Both of them did their dissertation on urban native plants. So what piques my interest about biodiversity in cities is the fact that urbanization does not equal disturbance when it comes to cities. About 20 years ago, ecologists and even some ecologists now think of urban places as just disturbed places, and that we ought to treat understanding biodiversity as a function of just disturbance in cities, and it's not. And if you take a look at these pictures here that I'm showing, you can see that there's lots of biodiversity, and it's a function of lots of different things that people are or are not doing. For example, over here in the upper left, we see a very manicured landscape with plenty of plants of different species, of different functional groups. We have a backyard garden. We have a stormwater detention pond with a semi-natural setting. And then we have abandoned backyard, abandoned right-of-way, where we see lots of weedy species. And of course, we have spontaneous wildlife like this coyote in a cemetery. So there's lots of different ways that biodiversity can emerge in cities. And there's lots of different rules, one of which is the environment locally filtering species into different niches. And the other is whether or not species can actually get to those locations to begin with. When it comes to plants, it's thought that most plants in areas like abandoned places, the reason why we don't see native plants there is because they can't survive there because they're being outcompeted by non-natives. We see non-natives all over the place, and that's true. Or is it because they can't get there? Is it because that we've built up the landscape such the native plants in the rural landscape can't disperse there? In other words, if we were to put them there, could they actually occupy the environment, the harsh environmental conditions that are there? And that's one of the things that we tested with this work. And I'll come back to that. And one of the reasons why we wanted to come back to that is that if we take a look at this one small part of the Baltimore City's Sustainability Action Plan, and this is not the current one that just came out, this is from one time step ago, one of the things that they highlight was under Protect Baltimore's Ecology and Biodiversity was manage Baltimore City's land to restore, conserve, and create habitat for native species and eliminate invasive plant species. So we wanted to test this idea of how do we maintain native biodiversity in places where native biodiversity doesn't occur in order to meet that goal, so make our work very relevant, and with the understanding that biodiversity also is related to the services that these species provide, and understand also that biodiversity has many dimensions, and that's something that ecologists are studying deeply. And that understanding those different dimensions of biodiversity could help us figure out whether or not we can get native species to occur in these harsh environments. So let me talk about these different dimensions of biodiversity. One of them is called, and I'm going to get into some deep ecology here, and I'm hoping I can get you to follow with me before we get to the results. One of these dimensions of biodiversity is called functional diversity. And this has to do with simply the traits that species have. So if I had two ecological communities or two ecological assemblages, community A and community B, one each with 4 species, A, B, C, and D. If species A and B were a grass and C and D were a dicot, we would call that low functional diversity. Where if species B, community B, species A was a grass, species B was a grass, species E was a dicot, and species F was a shrub, we would call that high functional diversity. So we have the same number of species, but they have very distinct life histories. So we're describing the biodiversity in this sense in terms of their strategies for coexistence. Somewhat tougher to wrap our heads around, at least for my undergraduates anyway, is phylogenetic diversity. And this has to do with shared evolutionary history. And if we had two communities, the one on the left and the one on the right, each one of these letters represents a species on a phylogenetic tree, and the communities are those that are in yellow. So in this case, species A, B, and C are in the same ecological community. They are more closely related. They would have low phylogenetic diversity. They are more closely related in evolutionary time, where species A, C, and F are more distantly related. So they would share less evolutionary time, and so therefore they would be less ecologically related, or assumed to be less ecologically related, in this case compared to over here. And so given the same number of species, we might expect very different types of functional and phylogenetic diversities, which can help us understand where species align themselves in niche space. And I'll come back to that. Because these things help us understand the role the species play in the environment. Because biodiversity is the foundation for many ecosystem services. And these are services that people derive from biodiversity, like soil formation, the role pollinators play, aesthetics, primary production, and insurance against abrupt shifts in the environment. So the portfolio effect, the idea that if the environment shifts and one species suffers, another in the community can take its place very easily. This is something that we're worried about when it comes to climate change. And so we have this, we hypothesize that this plot here of, if you plot phylogenetic diversity versus functional diversity, that you would get maximum services up here in this upper right. And the reason is that if you have high functional diversity or maximum traits in your ecological community, that you will fill out a lot of the niches that are available in the environment. And that if you have maximum phylogenetic diversity, you are filling out maximum niches, or at least identifying those niches that you failed to find when you identify the traits that you were using to identify the functional diversity that you were interested in. So the work that we were doing was carried out under the Baltimore Ecosystem Study Long-Term Ecological Research Site. This is termed an LTER. The National Science Foundation funds, I think, 24 of these across North America, Antarctica, and Puerto Rico. There are two urban ones. There's Baltimore and Phoenix, Arizona. It's been about 22 years, I think, that this has been going on in Baltimore. This work started back in 2014, but the LTER has been running since 1997, so it's been 24 years. But the LTER has been running since 1997, with most of the work being run out of Southwest Baltimore. Now, before I go further, I should let you know that when you do studies of this magnitude, you need help. And so I want to stop and acknowledge this outreach component that we did, where we enlisted the help of prisons. I developed a relationship with the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services as part of an extension of the Sustainability in Prisons project, which is out of Washington State University, in an effort to bring nature back into prisons. I was approached by someone in Maryland Corrections to do this, and there was sort of a collaborative effort. If I could help bring nature back into prisons somehow, I was able to enlist their help with inmate crews to come out and help establish the project, maintain the project, help collect the data, and keep it going on for a period of years, which was substantial given the size of the project, which I'll show you in a few minutes. So how do we bring nature back into the prisons? Well, I was able to secure resources to build them a high tunnel, facilitate a grow it and eat it program that was certified by the Baltimore City Master Gardeners. And those are some of the folks, some of the inmates there showing their certificate, and to support some of their urban agricultural efforts. There's some of their urban agriculture that they've done. The photo on the left is taken in the rain, but it's one of the best views that I have of what they're able to do. Those are their composting bins in the back, and then they created all of this themselves, starting all their plants inside. So the major question that we had for the research was, does increasing functional and phylogenetic diversity of the regional species pool, or the seed mix that we applied to the vacant lots, enhance native establishment on vacant land? The work was done in Harlem Park. So this is Harlem Park. So if you're familiar with Southwest Baltimore, this is Harlem Park here, and these little red squares simply identify where in Harlem Park we could do the work. We secured access to the land using the Adopt a Lot instrument that allowed us to basically license the property for a period of time as part of a greening effort. We got access to 25 lots, which run about 5 meters by 25 meters, so it's a significant amount of property. A little bit about vacant land in Baltimore. Right now, there are about 17,000 vacant lots, about the size that I talked about, and growing in Baltimore, which is substantial, and another 14,000 vacant homes that need to come down. And the rate at which the homes are coming down is just slowly being outpaced by vacancy by about 300 homes a year, or something like that. And so the rate at which homes are coming down is basically chasing the rate at which homes are being vacated. And so there's going to be an ever expanding, my point is there's going to be an ever expanding amount of vacant land that is going to be going on in the city. And so something has to be done with it. And part of the impetus of the project was simply, how do you maintain this property in the interim and as a environmental amenity before something is done with it. Either it's sold off, developed, or turned into a park or something. But studies by my graduate student, Anna Johnson, and she's published 2 papers on this in 2015 and 2017, that 80% of the plant species that occur on this vacant land are non-native, and that they occur there mostly by dispersal. In other words, the environment isn't filtering out species. It isn't kicking species out because they're no good there. Basically, whoever arrives will germinate. Which begs the question, well, why don't native species arrive and germinate? Some of the ones that should be living there, like a black-eyed Susan or a purple coneflower or a Coreopsis. We don't see those there, but should. This is what a vacant lot looks like once it comes down. I'm sorry, what a vacant lot looks like once the building comes down. And so you usually get this very orange soil with a lot of concrete in it. Of course, very little organic matter. They generally take the building, they topple the building, take what they can off the top, leaving the rest of it in the basement. And so what's in the basement is often a lot of concrete and brick and building material. And so it's very compact, often has some buried organic matter layers. Often it can go down a meter or 2. And so I don't want you to digest the next 2 slides, but this is the soil nutrient analysis we did. We sent the soil to Cornell. I've highlighted just 2 things. The first is that the pH is really high. And for those of you that do or have had soil analysis done or are familiar with soils at all, soil should be like around 4 or 5, something like that. A pH of 7 is really high for plants. So that's unusual. And the reason why it's high is because of the concrete. The concrete is raising the pH. The reason why none of the other characteristics are highlighted is that I matched those up with the EPA's ranges for what normal soil should be, or at least what they should not exceed in terms of toxicity. And none of these values exceed that. They might be high, but they don't exceed any toxic values, except for lead. Lead is high. So what was the experimental design? The design was to take 24 lots and clear them completely and let them reassemble, meaning that let them reseed. And so they either reseeded on their own, or they reseeded and they reseeded on their own, or they had seeds added for mixtures that we created, or there were lots that we took no action on at all. So there were 28 lots total that we monitored. 24 we had permission to take action on, and 4 that we monitored that we just sampled as we went along. Clearing involved mowing very close to the ground, and then killing all the grass, and then seeding simply on top, and then tamping down. Nothing more complicated than that. We wanted to do our treatment as cost for the least amount of money as possible, because if everything worked out, we wanted to be able to translate that into something that the city could do for the least amount of money, and make it cost effective for them. So in terms of what we reseeded with, we picked 12 species that we wanted to add. And we picked them from a phylogenetic tree that we created. Again, I don't want you to digest this whole thing. I simply want to show you that this is the list that we used. These are all herbaceous species. We picked 3 functional traits. They were life duration, were they perennial or annual? Functional group, were they a grass, a legume, or a forb? And when do they bloom? So we took aesthetics into account. Do they bloom in the spring, the summer, or the fall? we map those traits onto the phylogenetic tree so that we had both functional traits and evolutionary history together as one piece of information. And then we had to go through an exercise of creating that space, that functional by phylogenetic diversity space that I showed you earlier, to test the idea of whether or not that upper right-hand corner was actually going to be the area where we saw the maximum services or the highest response of high native cover. So we did that by randomly picking 12 species and calculating functional diversity and phylogenetic diversity, and doing that, I think we did it 10,000 times. And then what we did was we split this graph in half down vertically and half horizontally, and randomly picked 4 communities from one quadrat, 4 from this quadrat, 4 from this one, and 4 from this one, and use those as our mixes to seed with. And so this was a treatment of high phylogenetic, high functional diversity. So we expected here that if we were to plant with these species, that this ought to result in the highest native cover, highest species richness of natives in our vacant lots, if our predictions held up. Then these 2 high functional, high phylogenetic ought to be next, and we should see the least response over here, where we had low values of both functional and phylogenetic diversity. And the reason is because these functional traits, and any traits that phylogenetic diversity is carrying with it on the evolutionary tree, are identifying the niche space, or filling out the niche space that these species can have in this harsh environment. So we had 20 lots seeded with mixtures of n equal 12 species. So we varied the seed mix diversity. We fully crossed high and low phylogenetic and functional diversity of the seeded community. And so this is literally the lay of the land. So this is a zoom in of where we did the work. This is North Mount Street, West Lafayette. This is 1700 West Lafayette and Landville. And these strips here, this is about 5 meters by about 25 meters. And these are the plots here, and here's a row of them here. This happens to be a block with a fair number of them, and there was some dispersed a few blocks away. But that's what they look like from Google Earth. And each one of these is where a row home once stood. So March 2014, we had the inmates come out. March to April 2014, the inmates came out and helped us build fences in the front, helped us mow and clear the property. And then my grad students did the seeding. So this is Dorothy and this is Anna here doing the seeding. In July, we started to see germination and even some flowering. In July of 2015, we started to see multiple species come up and germinate. This is Coreopsis. This is perennial Coreopsis, and this is butterfly weed here. July 2016, we had full meadows growing, and in July 2017, we still had persistence of some of the species that we planted. This is the same lot from June 2014, early June, late June, and June 2015, just going from the same perspective, going through. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4 lots here. And this is, you can't even see them now, or in the June 2015 shot, you can't even demarcate them. And this is a close up of probably my favorite ones that this is a vacant home here, but these 2 lots turned out to be pretty good. So we looked at native species abundance, taxonomic, functional, and phylogenetic diversity of plants. So recall, we were asking, does augmenting the species pool lead to establishment of native dominating species, native dominated communities in vacant lots? So I'm going to take you through 3 slides with graphs. I'm going to walk you through each. The first graph is basically says that seeding alone enhances native cover and richness. So richness is just the number of different native species that we see. So on the left is native cover. So this is the mean proportion of native cover. So if you were to look down on a square meter of ground, what proportion of the ground cover is covered by native species is what we're measuring. And we have 2 bars for 2014, 2 for native 2015, and 2 for 2016. The orange is for the lots that were cleared and left to colonize on their own, and the blue are the ones that were cleared and reseeded. And the line is the average across all years for the lots that were unmanaged and were just surveyed over time that were untouched. And what we see is that very quickly, for native cover over time, we saw a fantastic increase where we planted species. And when I say fantastic increase, we're going to 35%, which means that we still have 65% non-native cover. But compared to 5% native cover long-term in our non-native, in our unmanaged plots, that's an increase of 7 times, which is significant. In terms of richness, we saw almost an immediate effect of going from going to 6 to 7 species of flowers, 6 to 7 species of natives. We planted 12, and this is above 3 on average, 3 to 3.5 species. So we just about doubled the number of native species that we saw in compared to unmanaged plots. But what about the response to phylogenetic diversity? The pattern was the same. This is averaged across years now. We're going from unmanaged to cleared, from low phylogenetic diversity to high. Again, I arranged the plots similarly with cover on the left-hand side to species richness on the right-hand side. We see an increase going from left to right, with high showing the highest response to cover. It appeared that we only needed to seed to get our highest response to richness. And with functional diversity, the response was quicker, or I guess a little bit more sensitive. Again, going from unmanaged to cleared to low to high. Our response was, even with adding seeds just in the low treatment, we got an immediate response to our highest proportion of cover in the low, as well as species richness. So if we go back to this hypothesized area of services, so the service that we're talking about here is the one that was called for in the Baltimore Sustainability Action Plan, which was restore native species. We do see maximum services at the high end for phylogenetic and functional biodiversity, but we also see it almost immediately at the low end for functional diversity. So we conclude that our plantings are establishing, and both dimensions of biodiversity seem to be important, although functional diversity seems to be a little bit, we seem to be getting, at least for the traits that we identified, they seem to be spot on. We still have non-natives. So recall we still have about 65 to 70% non-natives still present, but the natives that we do see are still well above and beyond what we see on unmanaged lots. The patterns are changing through time. We see an increase in richness. And we can safely say that if we believe what ecological theory tells us, that if the addition of natives or anything, that'll give us an insurance against disturbance in terms of being able to keep those natives around. For broader implications, this, in addition to what we know from other cities, cities like Detroit, for example, have been studying, folks in Cleveland have been studying vacant land for a while. Vacant land is a laboratory to study, to understand how services can be supported by biodiversity, the potential for non-traditional management and greening practices, and for testing basic ideas for ecological theory in urban places. This work is relevant to policy. I got a call the other day from someone in public works about the work to see whether or not we can translate some of the things that we've learned into some of the practices they want to implement. And we can link some ecological theory to sustainability goals. So I'll just return to this and say that what we've done directly addresses not only some ecological theory. So I've given you some deep stuff related to these deep dimensions of biodiversity, but they matter directly to, or they translate directly into something related to sustainability policy for the city. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge some folks. So some funding agencies, including the NSF, the Phipps Conservatory, the Maryland Native Plant Society, the Parks and People Foundation. Charlie Wall was my technician. That's Dr. Kathy Slavitz from Johns Hopkins University speaking to one of the residents when she was doing her sampling. And of course, the folks from Maryland Corrections and the Harlem Park neighborhood. So with that, I think I have time for some questions if you have them. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting and creative study. So thank you so much for walking us through all of that. And a reminder to our attendees to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. We've had a few come in so far. One question was, how did you source the seed that you used, and was that a challenge?
Yeah, so we went to Ernst seed that uses local seed and local genotypes when they can. Some of the species we used were not local to Maryland because we used local to the US. So things like little blue stem are prairie species, and we use those because these lots are hot and dry, and we wanted to cater to those conditions. So it wasn't a challenge because we had that such a great source for that, and the folks at Ernst were great in helping us sort that out.
Another question is in regards to climate change. Have you modeled the effects of climate change on your results?
No, we haven't thought that through. The one thing we can say is that it's been suggested that some of the effects of climate change that have been predicted to happen in general, people think have already happened in cities or are already happening in cities. So for example, things are already warmer in cities. The climate is already more variable in cities. And so I'm not suggesting that we don't have to consider it. What I'm suggesting is that we've already had to accommodate things like a much hotter environment when we did say when we had to consider our species list, for example, a much drier environment or a much more variable environment, for example. So I guess that sort of answers your question.
Okay. And have you conducted any social research related to your work, such as happiness impacts on neighbors near the greened areas?
So we get this question a lot, and we haven't, because I'm not a social scientist, and I haven't collaborated with one with that interest. Now, it has been done. It was done within the last 2 years in Philadelphia. And that work has shown that when you manicure vacant land, it actually leads to a better mental health and happier people. And this was done with, it was thousands of data points that they figured this out. So I haven't done it, but the suggestion is that if you do green and maintain your green space, it should translate into happier people.
That makes sense. Is the prison program ongoing, and have other prisons taken on the same initiative in the US?
It's not ongoing. These programs need a champion within the within the facility, and I have not experienced a institution that has more turnover in administration or more shuffling administration than I have as I've seen in prisons. And the person that was there retired, and I didn't have someone come in and with the enthusiasm that she did to take it on, and so it slowly fizzled out, which is fine. But mine is a small effort compared to the Sustainability in Prisons project, which you can Google, and I'm sure it's still going on out of Washington State, which is huge. And so it is being done elsewhere in multiple places. And there are lots of prisons across the US. There's a network of them that do this stuff to varying degrees. Not as much research as they do environmental practices, sustainability practices in their institution.
That sounds amazing.
It is. It's really cool, some of the stuff that they do.
Another question regarding the soil tests: was the soil retested for pH? I guess.
I think we did retest it, and the data is buried on my laptop, and I haven't seen it since.
Fair enough.
Well, I haven't seen it. I haven't reorganized it. Is what I'm saying.
Okay. And are you or is anyone surveying the biodiversity of insects or birds that are using a different next step, maybe?
No, we haven't done that. The only thing I could tell you anecdotally is, well, we had with the Parks and People Foundation, we had a program every summer where high school students were coming out and doing pollinator surveys. And what we learned, they were doing surveys of the plots that we reseeded, plots that were unmowed but not reseeded. So these were vacant lots that were just not mowed, and vacant lots that were mowed. And we found that biodiversity of pollinators was higher on lots that were unmowed and seeded, and slightly higher on those that were seeded. So we did do some insect work, but the biodiversity numbers were very coarse, because identifying pollinators is pretty hard. So they were very broad functional groups. So that's the extent of the invertebrate work that's been done. I haven't been able to find an expert that's wanted to come out and do invertebrate surveys. In terms of birds, no one's come out and do that. I can tell you that the birds are happy. We have plenty of
I'm
birds.
sure.
Yeah, the birds are thrilled to death with everything. We get a lot of bird life. Um, but yeah, that's the extent of it.
And have you considered working with schools to improve pollinator habitat and other ecosystem services of school grounds?
I've thought about it. I'm not that. Um, I need a partner to do that. Um, Someone that has a relationship with schools, and then we'd have to find a school or two that is willing to turn over the property or donate the land to do it. The bugger about it is that all of the action happens when the kids aren't in school. Um, so we've given that some thought, and I'm willing to do it. Establishing a pollinator garden establishing these things is not easy. And so it's sort of easy to think about, hard to do. And I guess we've never gotten the enthusiasm going just yet. So I guess the right thing, the nothing organic has happened yet.
Oh,
So
our chapter does have a schoolyard habitat grant program. So we do have some contacts with schools, mostly in Howard County area where we've funded their pollinator gardens. So maybe it's a potential.
so you guys know more than I do. Yeah, probably.
So maybe
Yeah.
we could partner up at some point. Um, and then in terms of, so thinking about school grounds, but then I was also wondering about are the implicated, just thinking back to that map with all the red dots and just seeing how much vacant land there is within the city, it kind of reminded me of like how much potential habitat there is in people's lawns, which people don't normally think of as habitat either. Would you say it's sort of a comparable um, way to think about in terms of the amount of land that is out there that is not typically thought of as habitat, but could be and should be habitat, and when you add it all up, is quite significant.
Oh, there's a lot of land. There's a lot of land. I mean, the city is like 80 square kilometers. I think I looked up, and the amount of vacant land is a few percentage points of it, which is a lot of green space. That's just the vacant land. You know, that doesn't add up people's backyards or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah. Interestingly, what is known is a lot of the pollinators live in the vacant homes.
Mm-hmm.
They nest there.
Right.
Yeah, we get a lot of that
Right.
because we were wondering where all the pollinators come from. Because
Right.
we get a lot of them, and we're like, where do they live? And that's one spot that they like to live in the downed homes.
And will anyone be monitoring the progress of these plots over time, as in like a 10 or 20-year period?
So I don't know what to do about that. We were the project had to come to an end. The Adopt a Lot program had to be shut off because of some community. The community became unhappy with the number of different types of projects that were going on in their community, and they felt like there was just too much going on, and they wanted it all to stop. And so the city, I think it's Public Works, ran that program, decided to stop that, and so they took all the licenses away, or they terminated the licenses when they were up for when they were re-upping them. And so we can't do the work anymore. I don't think there's anything stopping us from going out there and sampling. We just can't do any more manipulating. And so I should probably come up with a sampling to follow up soon on maybe 5 years. So it's a good question and a good reminder that I should probably do that,
Mhm.
especially since we're going to publish. We've written this up and sent it in for one round of peer review in November, and we've been invited to resubmit. So it'd be good to be able to get that out before we resample again.
A question that is, I guess, more for our chapter. Is anyone in Audubon currently or considering surveying relative bird populations? We do informal bird counts. I believe it's twice a year at our sanctuaries. Birdathon, which I mentioned at the beginning, is part of that. The Maryland DC Breeding Bird Atlas is also currently ongoing, and that's a periodic effort to survey populations of breeding birds in the region. And we definitely have some of our chapter volunteers that are participating in that, and also the public can participate as well. If you use eBird and you go into your settings, you can select the Maryland DC Breeding Bird Atlas portal, and your checklist will automatically get reported to that atlas. So that's something a community science program that everyone can participate in. That's really helpful for understanding trends in breeding bird populations, which have been of concern for some time now.
Okay.
And then one last question, it looks like. Could you talk a little about how you investigate carbon processing by river systems? That was something that I mentioned in the introduction. That was an interest of yours. And would restoring more city green space improve carbon sequestering by urban rivers?
Yeah, so you're going to be disappointed in my answer. First is that I don't work in urban streams at all. I only work in non-urban, non-rural streams. And when I talk about carbon processing, carbon in the form of basically leaf litter and wood that falls into streams, I look at the processing of that in small streams where that's the main energy source. So the processing is the processing of that material, which then becomes the energy source for the food web. So it's not looking at it from an angle of sequestering carbon or anything like that. I can talk for hours and hours and hours, and I just finished the book. The book on the subject is about to come out. I could talk about it for hours, but it's not in that context.
Well, oh wait, we just had another question pop in. What was the feedback of the neighbors pertaining to wildlife habitats? And the person notes that in trying to promote native plants in their community, they sometimes find it hard to get community members on board because unfortunately many people see them as a nuisance. And we did just recently, within the past couple of weeks, have legislation passed by Maryland state legislature that HOAs can no longer require homeowners to grow turf grass and prevent them from growing native plants. So that is great, at least from the perspective of HOAs. But what did you encounter with respect to the vacant lots?
So two things. The first is people wanted to know whether or not it was going to attract rats. And then we had to assure them that no, rats are attracted to garbage, not vegetation. And once we assured them of that, we didn't hear anything else about wildlife. People were not concerned about wildlife. The main concern people had about this exercise was, and any exercise when it comes to vacant lots, is does it look neat? If they had, and this isn't special to my project, this is the city, and they learned this in Philadelphia, is they want the edges to look nice, and they want if they could have it mowed, great. But even if you had it tall like we had it, does it look maintained? Is what they wanted. Otherwise, it looks a mess. If it doesn't look purposeful, it's a mess and it's unsightly and it's not an amenity any longer. But even if you just ran your mower along the edge, it looked like something was happening. And so if it had tall flowers in there, great. But that's what people were most concerned with. And if you kept the garbage out, that'd be good too. But usually that was easy to do. Once you did it once, and got rid of it, it would you would keep it out pretty easily.
Mhm.
That's what people were most concerned about. Wildlife wasn't a concern once we educated them on the rat issue. We never saw anything other than birds. Never any rodents of any kind, an occasional cat, but that's it.
Yes, and in regard to the questioner's point, and what you said about edges, that is something that is recommended if you are trying to establish natives in your yard, to have mowed edges, and to also introduce purposeful elements, statues, garden stakes, things like that, just to make it look like it's there on purpose, it's intentional, it's not something that's just being left to grow wild, even though it is. Just to have more of that human, a little bit of human touch there can help sometimes in communities. So I think that's all the questions that we have. And we have, yeah.
These are great.
Thank you as well for the great presentation. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing all of this with you. It's a lot to think about, and just very creative. And look forward to this research being built on in the future, hopefully.
Okay.
So thank you very much, everyone. The webinar is being recorded, and we hope to post it on our YouTube channel, barring any technical difficulties. So if you want to watch it again, or if you know someone that wasn't able to attend, just look for that link on our social media accounts, in our newsletter. Yeah, so thank you very much, everyone, and have a good night.
Okay, bye.